just before the knife came down, Abraham was willing to do it. The Bible tells us an angel stopped him. This was really just a test of faith and a test of love. And one reason that Abraham is so great in this story is because he demonstrated that he loved God more. Would you like to see your children saved? The best thing you could do for your children is to love them less than you love God. Because you are commanded to love the Lord with all of your heart. If God has all of your heart, that means you do not love son or daughter, father or mother, husband, wife, houses or lands, anything more than God. The Christian life is a big sacrifice. It costs something, but it pays more than it costs.
But the thing is, Genesis 22 presents to us a story in which a lot of people read it and they, traditionally or not traditionally, and they read it with one assumption, that it's immoral to kill your children and that this is somehow some sort of moral absolute.
Abraham was going to slay his son. How is that a good thing? I would be thrown in jail for doing the same thing.
So the dilemma with Abraham and Isaac is, when we go back in the ancient world, yes, I doubt there were any parents that were like, yes, I'm happy to, I'm really excited to go kill my kid. But it was normal. It was, even if your society didn't practice it, you knew others did. You understood that this could be in the conceptual world of what a divine being would request as an ultimate sign of fidelity. Micah himself, as the prophet, says, talking about all the things you could give, you don't even want the firstborn of us, but like he's saying it like he presumes a God would, like that would make sense.
Now, was it practiced in Israel and Judah? Well, apparently so.
There are prophetic condemnations of it.
Yes, and you don't condemn things that nobody was doing.
Right.
Now, but it's not only prophetic condemnations of it. You have stories about King Ahaz and King Manasseh making their sons pass through fire. Mm-hmm. That's usually taken to mean sacrifice them by burning. Yeah. Now, we have the case in the prophet Micah of the hypothetical person praying to the Lord, Lord, with what should I come before you? Right. Should I sacrifice my firstborn for the sin of my soul? Mm-hmm. Again, this would not make any sense if people weren't doing it. There was a Tophet, or a place, as the late Morton Smith used to say, for burning babies, outside of Jerusalem, that was only destroyed by King Josiah. Jeremiah is still thundering against it. Mm-hmm. That's now at the time of the Babylonian exile.
And so the dilemma becomes that people read Genesis 22 and they think, Abraham doesn't argue with God about this. And they're like, I can't believe he's not doing that.
So Abraham is learning to challenge God, but he doesn't quite learn enough. So in Genesis 18, a few chapters earlier, he protests the possible destruction of Sodom because Lot and his family, Lot is his nephew, they're living there.
Yeah.
And one of the phrases he uses is, will not the judge of all the earth do what is right? Telling God he should, holding God to his standards of righteousness. And I wonder if he could have said something there again in Genesis 22. Take your son, your only son, whom you love, and sacrifice him. God, you can't do that. You're the judge of the whole earth. You're the righteous God. You can't ask me to do this, because you wouldn't do this.
And some of you might be wondering, how did he know this was God's voice? Why would God ever ask such a thing? I mean, wouldn't it be the devil that would say this?
But that's from our perspective, because of how we value children, how we think of it. If you go back to his perspective, guess how it changes? Oh, it's not that unremarkable that he would accept this. It's not that weird that he would be like, oh, okay, so this is what you're saying. What then does stand out from reading it through the lens of that culture then, not ours? That he gives hints that he is not believing it when he says things like, me and the boy, we're going up there and we're going to come back. Or when he tells Isaac, there will be a sacrifice provided by the Lord. And people read that through our moral lens and they think, oh, he's lying to the servants in order for them to not want to go ahead and prevent him from going up. Oh, he's lying to his son in order to prevent his son from running away.
What do you think Abraham's going to say to the men? What do you think Abraham's going to say in front of his son? Hey, you guys stay here and watch the animals while Isaac and I go up here and worship, and then I'll be back. He's not going to do that. don't get it. Where's the lamb for the burnt offering? Father, you cut the firewood. We've made this long journey. We're going to go up and make a sacrifice, but don't we have to have a lamb for a sacrifice? Is he going to say to Isaac, I didn't bring a lamb, Isaac, because you're it?
See, this is the problem with when we try to read stories through our lens. We're not really picking up on what the narrators wanted to say in their own time. We're not picking up on the clues, the narrative pieces, because we're so interested in saying, why isn't he acting like we do? Why isn't his morality, his viewpoint like us?
It seems to me reasonable that somebody who just grabbed them and took off on a trek might say something like, hey, we're going to go over here and be right back, because saying, I'm going to take my son up there and kill him might have gotten a slightly different response. Who knows?
The dilemma is when you go back to that culture and you realize child sacrifice would not have struck those servants as weird. I mean, whether they liked it or not, and given their stations, they certainly wouldn't have felt empowered to do anything. The reason to lie isn't there. So then suddenly you're left with the other option. Does Abraham have faith that this story is going to turn out different? On the one hand, we have a story in which it doesn't say that he argued with God, and it does suggest he just accepts silently what God said. That seems at the very beginning of the story as though that happens. And I do believe that part of the dilemma is that people read God tested Abraham. Then they read what he says to Abraham, and they presume that the test is, will he do it?
God's command to sacrifice Isaac was to provide an example of absolute obedience.
He had every right to require the death of Isaac. He didn't owe that life to Abraham. And if God gives you a direct command, then you're responsible to carry it out, which is what Abraham tried to do.
Do we obey God or man? And God always trumps man. So what he asked Abraham to do in taking a life would be perfectly within his right, because Isaac was a sinner and deserved the same thing the Canaanites deserved or anybody else deserved.
But the problem is the Bible tells us the king of Moab was offering his children as a sacrifice. So what? Abraham has enough faith that a Moabite can have the same thing? Except he did better. The Moabite actually killed him.
I want to read a story to you in the Bible. In 2 Kings chapter 3, verse 26, there's a war between Israel and the king of Moab. And it says, when the king of Moab saw that the battle was too fierce for him, then he took his eldest son, who would have reigned in his place, the crown prince, and he offered him as a burnt offering on the wall. And there was great indignation against Israel. The only way the kingdom could be saved was this king offered his crown prince. Human sacrifice was not unheard of, but it was something the pagans did.
I mean, it seems weird to put that as the penultimate test. But then we also know, or some of my students do not in classes, they're shocked to find out that the rest of the Hebrew Bible condemns child sacrifice. You've got God and Jeremiah say, I have never requested a child to be offered for me. And don't let anyone ever claim that I've ever asked for such a horrible thing, an evil thing. I condemn all of you in Israel for doing such things in my name. So, there's a strong prohibition. The Psalm says anyone who asks, any deity that asks you for a child sacrifice is actually a demon. Right? That's in the Psalms. How does that affect Genesis 22? Right? So there's this sense in which the Bible's tradition later is absolutely, this is contrary to who God is. But that's all after Abraham. Abraham has never had a Mount Sinai. He's never had a big moment where God reveals all his different wills and beliefs. So to a certain degree within the narrative, I'd argue, you shouldn't presume necessarily that Abraham somehow, without God ever telling him, has just received this revelation that God isn't like all the other deities or many of the other deities. So for me, at least how I read this personally, is I think the testament to Abraham's faith is that he perceives, without God having to order him, that this is not aligned with God's will. But if you read the end of the story, the angel comes back to Abraham and says, because you obeyed my voice. Well, there were two voices in that story. The one that said, go kill your son, and the voice of the angel that said, stop, stop.
He looks up and he sees his father raise his arm, stretching it above the chest. Isaac is looking up. He's seeing the knife. He realizes that his father is going to plunge that knife into his heart. And just as Abraham is ready to bring the knife down into this chest of his son, we read that the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, "Abraham, Abraham."
Now, Abraham had a choice. He could have ignored the angel. I mean, it was Elohim who spoke in the beginning. It's the angel of Yahweh at the altar. He could have heard the words of Paul in the future. If anyone comes to you, even an angel with a message opposite of what I have told you, they are to be an anathema. Reject them. But Abraham accepts what the angel says, stops. He listens to the voice, and no one tells him, go offer the ram. It's been provided. He, on his own, takes the ram and offers it in place of Isaac, on his own conviction of what he believes God wants. And so I do think that a central element of this, and it's in spirit with Hebrews, which also kind of somewhat goes along with this line, is that Abraham has a faith that transcends simply what he's read, what he's heard through God's words already. It's something built off of them, a character, an intuition of this is God's character, this doesn't align.
In order for God to be testing Abraham, whether he's doing it for his benefit or Abraham's benefit, the test must be, does my servant Abraham have the correct understanding of who I am, of my character, of what I would expect from him? This means that Abraham was rewarded for having a correct understanding of God.
And I think that's what makes, for myself, that's what makes the Abraham story powerful for faith, is that he doesn't need God to explicitly tell him this is wrong, for him to know that this isn't in alignment with what God's character is, such that this then now actually rises above the Moabite in faith and actually does somehow represent a picture that is unique amongst the other portraits we have of child sacrifice elsewhere in the ancient Near East. But that's my particular reading of it.
I just want to give a quick shout out over to Adventist Today and thank them for being the sponsors of this video.